Introductions pointed out, I'm actually a professor in ethnic studies and critical gender studies, and that's what I like to tell people is actually not what I do. Because when I tell people what I do, I'm a historian, they fall asleep. They don't history, high school, and they get really woozy or tell me bad stories about dates that they don't remember. But that's not what I do, per se, and in fact, being a historian in ethnic studies here at UCSD, and I'm here, this is my fourth year at UCSD in ethnic studies, allows me to do something that UCSD really prides itself on, be an interdisciplinary scholar. So I do use my historical frameworks and work, but I do it within an interdisciplinary framework, and I give a plug for ethnic studies because it helps me to do that work. In part, ethnic studies is one of the, I would say, premier departments in the nation that looks at race relationally, that looks at race intersectionally, and looks at it transnationally. And that's pretty significant given that we're right on the borders, as the video pointed out. And also that in California, you have a really framework for thinking about multiracial identities and race relationally among the range of people and racialized populations that live here. And so ethnic studies as a department really tries to center that work and think about it in critical and innovative ways. And it has been doing that for quite a while. It's one of the reasons I decided to come. But it has also helped me to do my work in that framework as a historian. So I do talk about dates and things that happened in the past, but I try to build on it through an interdisciplinary framework that really looks at, one, how we might center transnational networks, how we might examine race as it travels, and for me, I'm really interested in the ways in which we might think about Black people's experiences and the ideas of African American identity as it travels not only in the United States, but globally, and it does travel globally. And also thinking about not only the ways in which we might think about race, but how it intersects and shapes ideas of gender, sexuality, power, politics, right? And so that's sort of my work as in broad terms that is informed by ethnic studies. And currently I'm working on a book project that looks at African American women's transnational travels and activism in what historians like to call the long 20th century, which dates from about the 1890s to the 1980s for me, 1990s. And in that work, I'm really interested in putting all those ideas into practice. Right? What does it mean for women to travel, right? Particularly in the 1890s, when it was sort of an idea that you didn't travel alone. What does it mean for Black women to travel in the 1890s so soon, particularly African American women, so soon after the end of transatlantic slave trade, right? Where you didn't see free Black people traveling. And then I want to trace that to different significant moments. What does it mean to travel during World War II? And I look at women who do that. What does it mean to travel during the civil rights Black power movement, during decolonization that's happening all over the globe, on the African continent, in China, in Asia, and upheavals that are happening in Western Europe and the United States during the 60s. So today I want to talk to you about the 60s, right? And when I started studying, the 60s was the hip age, and I feel like my students today are like, the 60s, what is that? Maybe they do Sun God, and that reminiscent of the 60s. That's it. But we can still see the political relevance of the 60s. You can think about the election, the ways in which what the candidates were doing to during the 60s became a source of conversation and topic around Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton. I don't know if they talk about Trump, but I don't know so much. But I'm interested in that moment, right? Particularly because this is a moment where I look at what African American women travel internationally, particularly to decolonizing countries, as sort of representatives of the Black political struggle, the civil rights movement and Black power movements that are happening in the United States. And in part, this moment is interesting. One of the things I do as a historian is think about the context in which the period I'm studying is being shaped by. And so I'm interested in the 60s and ways in which solidarity politics emerged among Black activists, and particularly activists in China, but it emerged through a particular context, civil rights and Black power. This is a moment in which Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, their images, their political movements are circulating internationally, right? Not just in the United States, but internationally. I'm interested in the ways in which the co-war politics of the period, where the United States as a government is challenging communist countries such as the Soviet Union and China in this period, right? And how that shaped, as well as the ways in which McCarthyism and the Vietnam War is impacting the U.S. at home. I'm interested in the broad decolonization movements that are happening. During this period, there's a major conference called the Bandung Conference that brought together Afro and Asian nations together to sort of build unity. So I'm interested in how that shapes their politics. I'm also mostly looking more specifically interested in China's ideas of a people's diplomacy and foreign trade. Because it's cut off from having diplomatic relationships with the United States because of the Cold War, it really relies on building relationships with local activists in different countries, and particularly African American activists who are active in the civil rights movement. And the last thing I'll talk about is, that shapes this context, is the popularization of Mao Zedong thought. Particularly, I don't know, it's a famous quotation book called The Little Red Book, and it's circulated internationally broadly. And so you can see in part some of the ways that sort of China built these solidarities. I don't know if I guess the imagery is not great, but there's this picture up here of a poster that was produced in China that says, "End discrimination in the United States, end racial discrimination." And in part, I'm interested in the ways in which African Americans engaged a country that was engaging them. And I do this mostly through the figure of Vicki Garvin. Vicki Garvin, who has passed away some maybe 5-10 years ago, was an activist and a labor organizer in New York, was an economist, received an MA from Smith College in economics, and worked early on in labor economics, and then became active in the union. In the 40s and 50s, was very active in New York with figures like Paul Robeson, who was a very well-known singer, actor, and activist in W.E. Du Bois. And then by 60, she really looked out in the world and saw all of the sort of political change, nation building happening in Africa and Asia, and wanted to become a part of it. So she traveled. She left the United States in 61, first landed in Nigeria, then moved to Ghana and helped the sort of nation building project in Ghana. And then while she was in Ghana, the ambassador to China was there, invited her to come to China. And she does. She ends up leaving Ghana and going to China in 1964. She arrives there, and her job when she arrives there is to teach English at the Shanghai Foreign Language Institute. And she lives at the Peace Hotel, which is a very famous hotel from colonial periods in China, along the Bund, which is a famous section of China. I'll have a picture later. So in looking at someone like Vicki Garvin, she was not alone in coming there. A number of African Americans ended up living in China. But it's interesting to look at them in the 60s because they're there during a key moment. The moment that in China is referred to as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, a moment of profound upheaval, violent political debate, and she was in the midst of it and sort of trying to talk about that, write about that, understand that. In fact, she's living in Shanghai, which becomes one of the centers of the Cultural Revolution. Basically, students take to the street, they make these big poster boards of political statements, and they put them all over. They ride the rails to sort of mobilize and police experts who they think aren't carrying forth the revolution. And she's sort of in the midst of that, so much so, she loses her job. She can't teach us at Shanghai Foreign Language Institute because there are no students there anymore. They're all in the streets. And so she ends up moving to Peking, traveling around a little bit, and interacting with a whole community of activists there. And this picture up here is of her, I don't know if you can see her, among a bunch of young students, and her husband, who she meets, who's also Leibel Bergman, an activist in China, and she meets him while she's there. And so I'm interested in thinking about how she lives in China, but not just the politics. I like the politics, but one of the bonuses of being a historian is that you get to read people's personal papers and call it work, right? So I'm also interested in how and it also matters how people survive, how they live, how they find love, right? How they operate in foreign places, what they miss culturally about their country, what they understand differently about themselves. And so I'm also interested in those aspects, which are sometimes difficult to get to if they don't have a diary or something, but I try to piece it together through a range of evidence, so forth and so on. And then I also one of the key points of the paper, even though I do enjoy the diaries and I like the love story that emerges between her and Leibel, and I actually got to interview his son and daughter were very excited to tell me about their experiences with Vicki Garvin. One of the other things she begins to represent in this moment is a figure sort of announcing solidarity with China for African American activists in the U.S. And so in part, she's talking, I want to investigate the ways in which she tries to build that solidarity. Not state to state, not sort of a traditional diplomatic solidarity, but between African American activists and organizations and a government, which is a unique moment to think about. And in part, I'll end by saying that I think about this moment, as historians, we like to write about the past, and really, I like to write about the past because no one, well, sometimes they do, but rarely do people stand up and say, I lived through that and that's not correct. It does once you get past the 50s, but in part, you think you write about the past, you can sort of explore it, have free reign. But in part, as a historian writing about the past, I'm always informed by the present. I live in the present, the questions I'm interested in are shaped by the present. And one of the interesting things to write about African Americans in China during this moment is to write about sort of transnational activism in the age of Obama and the age of globalization. And both those things, I had the privilege of traveling to Shanghai in March and doing some research there. And this is the Peace Hotel, I don't know if you can see it. They have a museum there that I was able to sort of look at some of the documents and also visit some of the Cultural Revolution relics and posters and things like that. And it became clear to me that, one, Obama's very popular in China. So I don't know, he took a tour, him and his family took a tour recently, and so at all the tourist sites they have pictures of Obama. And that becomes a conversation about how they understand blackness currently, right? And how they think about it, which is important, shapes my work. But also the ways in which China is sort of writing a history, and you can go to the National Museum and other places and see the writing of Chinese history in these museums, and the archives, that in some ways erases the Cultural Revolution because it doesn't fit the current narrative of China today. And so I went to the Peace Hotel and I thought, wow, I'll get the records of Vicki Garvin living there. And you go and you look, they have records of people early, later, that period, nothing. Yeah. And it's interesting to think, it's actually, if you talk to scholars who do work in China, it's been a question about how you can get access to the archives and things like that. So I just will end you with that. Even though I talk about the past and I did give you some dates, in part my work is also about thinking about the moment, right? It's informed by the questions and ideas and conversations and alliances that are very present in our moment. Thank you very much.